toward the end. Now it's being recorded. Thank you for not making me a liar, Janelle. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bill Walker. He is our interim executive director.
Morning. Thank you for being here. I can't tell if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Now let's keep trying this, because if this doesn't work, I might just have to yell into the room, and that's not going to work very well. But we're going to switch. How's that? That is much, much, much better. Thank you for being here. It's exciting to have people here again. It's been a long time since we've done an in-person meeting, and we're excited at getting back to it. As Amanda said, I'm Bill Walker. I am the interim executive director. When this stint is over, sometime in January, I'm going to go back to being, she's doing her best. I'm going to go back to being, how's that? The deputy executive director with, among other things, responsibility for budget and planning, which is kind of the theme for today. Mike Lipsky is going to kick us off with a little bit of an update. One more time. There we go. Now, if we can do this without feedback, I think we're okay. Where was I? I was telling you that Mike Lipsky is going to kick us off talking about the search process for the next executive director, which some of you may be involved in. But the headline for today is budget and planning. As we said, we're going to start off with Ben Neerad from my department, who's going to talk about budget process, how we manage our funds, a little bit of a preview of the 25 budget. We'll take questions after his presentation, and then we'll turn it over to Todd Giebert, who's going to give you an update on capital projects. There are way too many to go through, but he's going to talk about some of the big ones, some of the important ones, our progress on those, and some forward-looking for those projects. And again, questions after he is done. That is all I have. I'm going to stop testing this microphone anymore and turn it over to Mike.
Test, test, test. Mike, I think you should probably use this one.
I guess we'll see. All right, hi everybody. I'm Mike Lipsky. I'm the HR director here at the district, and I'm happy to provide an update with regards to the executive director search, because Bill is giving me lots of pressure to make sure that it gets done in a timely fashion. So I'm happy to say I've been working with the commission, and the commission put together a subcommittee specifically focused on the recruitment. And Commissioner Bookland is here. I'm pointing her out, sorry. And Commissioner Romo has also participated in a couple of the meetings of the subcommittee. The subcommittee has been meeting regularly since May. The first task of the subcommittee was to update and put together the job description for the executive director, as well as to solicit an executive search firm to conduct the recruitment on their behalf. This is common practice with high-level positions to have an executive search firm to conduct those recruitments. Tends to be a conflict of interest to have, staff at the district hiring their boss. I highly encourage the commission to go this route. So I'm really happy that that's what they chose to do. So the good news is a lot of progress has been made in the last 3 months. A job description has been updated and is going to the full commission for approval at the meeting next Thursday. In addition, a contract has been signed with Raftellus, and that's the executive search firm who's going to be leading the recruitment. The Raftellus is already jumping on the process. They hope to have recruitment materials ready for initial review by the end of this month, and their goal is to have the position out on the street by the week of Labor Day. So things are progressing well on that front. The next steps with the commission is going to be working out what exactly the interview process looks like for the position. But, you know, all of the surveys that have been done, including the owner community feedback, has been presented to the subcommittee, and it's definitely expected that once the finalists are chosen and we get to an in-person interview process, that there's going to be a robust process that not only includes the commission interviewing the candidates, but also some measure of engagement with district staff, as well as with the owner communities. Now, what that looks like is yet to be determined, but that's where Raftellus is really going to be working with the commission to lock down that process and make sure that all of those voices are heard and incorporated as part of the feedback. So that's what I have for an update. Any questions? Well, because we're running into the end of the year, I know it's middle of August, hard to believe, but with the position out on the street in September, we would be looking at interviews anticipated probably, you know, late October, early November, but at that point, you know, then with holidays at the end of the year, the goal would be somebody starting, you know, right after the new year. All right, with that, I get to kick it to Ben. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Test. Folks hear me okay? Is that coming through? Here? Now? Test, test, test. Good? Okay. All right. So I'm Ben Neerad. I'm here today to present on our budget process and give you a little bit of a budget preview as well. I work for Bill in the budget and planning area. So in terms of the agenda today, for my presentation, I'll provide, as I said, an overview of the budget process, our fund structure, so you have a little bit of context to kind of understand how we put our budget together. Provide a preview of the 25 budget. You know, we're still working on putting that together for the September introduction, but provide a little bit of a preview and then a summary of next steps so you have a sense of kind of where we go from here for our budget. So starting with our budget process, it includes all three of our funds that we use, operating, capital, and debt. And I'll talk, as part of this first section of the presentation, I'll talk about those three funds and how we use those, because when we're putting our budget together, it's really, in a sense, these three separate but connected budgets. And then we also look over multiple years to smooth rates and plan for future spending. You know, one of the themes you'll hear is, you know, we've got a 6-year CIP. And so what we do as part of that is put together a financing plan that looks over that same 6-year time horizon. One second, sorry. All right, there we go. So I'll start with the operating fund. So operating fund might be one that folks are generally familiar with. In terms of the purpose, you know, we're paying for staff and supply costs. That receives most of our revenue, right? So the district's primary source of revenue is our service charges that we bill communities each quarter. Those service charges go to the operating fund. And then from the operating fund, we have transfers going to our capital and debt funds to support capital construction and debt payments that I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. So in terms of how we approach budgeting for operating funds, this is probably not going to be much different than what you all are used to. You know, we're estimating expenses in terms of staff, supplies, and those transfers that I mentioned for the coming years. We estimate non-service charge revenues. So service charges bring in now roughly about $55 million in revenue. So that's the vast majority of our revenue, but we do have some other sources of revenue. Folks may be familiar with pumping station servicing costs that you pay to the district. We sell struvite, which is a byproduct of our treatment process. So we've got some other sources of revenue that we're estimating. And then essentially the gap between operating expenses and non-service charge revenues, that makes up the next year's service charge requirement. So I want to talk just a little bit about that, just to make sure that folks are kind of have a sense of how this all comes together. So again, we start with budgeted operating costs minus non-service charge revenues. That equals, again, next year's service charge revenue requirement. So if we have an increase, that's the number that's increasing in terms of our rates. That service charge revenue requirement goes into our rate calculation. So essentially, we are setting, for folks who might not be as familiar, we've got 7 different rate parameters that are part of your quarterly bills. They speak to components like the volume of wastewater that comes to the district, the strength of wastewater, and the population of each community. So we're essentially setting a rate that, based on estimates in terms of the flows and strength of wastewater that we're getting, we're estimating we'll get that much in our service charge revenue requirement. And then ultimately, those rates flow into quarterly service charge billings. Those billings are based on actual measured flows and strength of wastewater that we sample and measure as we go into the next year. So in 2024, that will be based on, or I should say for the 25 budget, that will be based on measured flows and loads as we go into 2025. So one thing to note is that our actual service charge revenue will necessarily vary from the budgeted number that starts this process, because the rates that we set are based on estimates of flows and loads that we expect to get in the next year, but an actual billing is based on measured flows and loads that we are actually seeing in that next year. So there's always going to be a difference, again, in terms of budgeted service charge revenues versus actual service charge revenues. So back to the operating fund and our budgeting process. So for each of our funds, we have a reserves approach. Again, probably not unfamiliar for you all. Money that we are setting aside as kind of a rainy day fund to mitigate risks that we have in terms of not getting the revenue we expect or having expenses that are beyond what we expect. In the case of our operating fund, we are seeking to cover 180 to 210 days of operating expenses. If we go above 210 days, such as if service charge revenues are above what we had expected, what we had budgeted for, we have commission policy in place that basically speaks to the options to consider with that funding. And the policy lays out kind of the order of consideration, which I'll just mention briefly. It's contributions to our equipment replacement fund, which is a separate fund that's part of a DNR, Wisconsin DNR requirement. Transfers to the capital fund, transfers to the debt fund, funding of one-time expenditures, and a buy down of the required service charge revenue. So if one of your questions coming into this is, well, what happens when we get more than expected service charge revenues? That's essentially the process that we follow. So I'm going to transition now from operating fund and over to capital fund. So our capital fund is essentially our capital project construction fund. So we pay upfront costs for infrastructure projects until the DNR reimburses us. And by that, I mean, most of our projects are financed through the DNR Clean Water Fund loan program. I know some communities use it, some don't. For folks who aren't familiar with that, essentially, we can get subsidized low interest loans under that state-run program. But as part of that, we have to pay for construction costs upfront. We then submit those costs to the DNR and get reimbursement later. So we need monies in the capital fund sufficient to pay for those upfront costs. We also, so I think for 25, we're expecting about 80% of our project costs to be, loan funded, roughly 20% cash funded. So for cash funded projects, we've got money, again, going into the capital fund to pay for those projects. In terms of budgeting for our capital fund, so mentioned this already, Todd will speak more to this, but we're developing a 6-year CIP with our necessary construction projects, and we're determining costs through that process, essentially, for capital fund expenses. We then determine the funding source for projects, right? And typically that's a cash versus debt determination. I spoke earlier, we're kind of roughly in the 80-20 debt versus cash in the short term. A little bit of a wrinkle now on that for us as we go into 2025. The DNR Clean Water Fund loan program has gotten very popular recently with all the new federal money coming in, and it's oversubscribed, which means we likely will not be able to get all the loans that we had expected for our projects. And so we will likely be pursuing geo bonding to pay for some amount of our projects. So that cash versus debt, now the debt piece of it has a little bit of a nuance there in terms of that, you know, is it a Clean Water Fund loan that's financing that, or is that a bond? As part of our budgeting process, we're determining expected fund revenues that come into the capital fund. So that's, again, that DNR Clean Water Fund reimbursement. It's the transfers from the operating fund that I mentioned earlier. It's also connection charge revenue. So just briefly, this is another source of revenue that the district has, relatively minor compared to service charges, but this is for when new developments are connecting to the district's collection system and treatment plant. There's a connection charge that's levied essentially. And so we have revenues that come in directly to the capital fund to help pay for construction projects. You know, one question that might be out there is what happens if money is left over, right? So if we don't fulfill the CIP in terms of the projects that we expected for a given year, what happens to that money? That money is retained in the capital fund. So it's not used for kind of other non-capital related purposes. That money is retained there, and it goes towards, you know, future authorized project spending, right? So if we had a project in 24 that didn't get done, got shifted to 25, that money would be there in 25, and we wouldn't need to raise service charges to pay for that project. As with operating fund, we have a reserves approach on the capital fund. We're really looking at that risk of not having sufficient revenue or having unexpected or emergency work and kind of mitigating that risk. This is our reserve policy related to the capital fund is something that we're reviewing with PFM, who's our new financial advisor. They're helping us with pursuing bonding, but then also serving as a resource to look at reserves as well. So I'll talk a little bit about this later when I talk about the 25 budget and what we're seeing there, but just planting a little bit of a seed there related to our capital fund reserve. So finally, I'll end with the debt fund in terms of our fund structure. This is probably the most straightforward. So we're paying loan payments now on those DNR Clean Water Fund loans. So it's just paying that principal and interest payments on those loans. And budgeting reserves is pretty straightforward. We have a DNR requirement that we need to abide by to transfer money there sufficient to pay next year's principal and interest payments a year in advance. So when we go through our budgeting process, that's essentially what we're trying to solve for. So I mentioned this earlier, you know, we're really looking at a multi-year approach when we go through our budgeting process. We've got the 6-year CIP, so we can look at capital and debt fund kind of inflows and outflows over that same 6-year period. This allows for a degree of rate smoothing and for planning of future large expenses, right? So if we know, for example, that in year 3 of our 6-year CIP, we've got a significant expensive project, we can kind of ramp up to pay for that and not have, you know, a double-digit 15–20% rate increase in that given year just to pay for that project. One thing to note, though, is that as we put together our budget, you know, we're looking at a 2025 budget, but when we make changes in the short term in 2025, for example, that can affect that entire 6-year trajectory. So we have to be careful as we put our budget together to say, okay, a tweak that we make to the budget for 25 could, you know, for example, put at risk our debt fund reserves in 2027, right? So those are the things that we are looking at as we're putting our budget together. So that's just in a quick nutshell, again, kind of what the district's fund structure is. I hope that's helpful as you kind of dig into our budget proposal next month. But I do want to just, before I finish up, share a quick 2025 budget preview. There are budget drivers that we are seeing in terms of, you know, what's driving costs for 2025. So one, electrical, gas, water, and chemical costs. So we know that utility costs are increasing. We're seeing that now. Our chemical costs that are required as part of our treatment process are increasing as well. So that's driving our budget. I mentioned that we are likely to pursue general obligation bonding. That means higher interest rates, right? So we're no longer only getting those subsidized Clean Water Fund loans to finance our construction projects. but also these higher interest rate GO bond loans as well. We are considering staffing needs, right? So we're seeing a need for some pretty critical frontline positions that we expect to be part of our 2025 budget as well, that are involved with kind of basically the treatment process and accepting waste as well. And then in terms of mitigating factors, so those are the budget drivers. And sorry, there should be a bullet up top there. I'm not sure what happened to my animation, but we're ramping up to a higher level of capital spending, right? So that's, I don't want to kind of bury the lead, and that'll be what Todd's presentation is about, is kind of looking forward to 25 and beyond in terms of this higher level of capital spending. But that's certainly a budget driver there, and that bullet may populate when I get to the end here. But so again, if those are budget drivers, we also are seeing mitigating factors in terms of things that are maybe putting downward pressure on our rates. So one is, I mentioned connection charge revenues coming into our capital fund. We are expecting higher levels of connection charge revenue than we had budgeted for last year. You know, as we were putting together our budget last year, we were seeing the Federal Reserve with high interest rates, you know, expecting to some degree seeing that as in terms of a slowdown in housing development, and therefore a reduction in expected connection charge revenue. That didn't happen. You know, the housing market continues to be strong here, and we're seeing that come through in our connection charges as well. And then I mentioned earlier that we're looking at our fund reserve methodology with our municipal financial advisor, PFM, related to our capital fund reserves. So it looks like we'll probably be able to draw those down to a degree, which means we won't need essentially the service charge revenue to support that level of reserves. So more to come there, but that's, you know, again, drivers, things that are, there we go. Things that are, you know, putting an upward pressure on our revenue needs, mitigating factors, putting a downward pressure. So, you know, we don't have a final budget yet, but, you know, if you're asking, you know, what does that mean from a rate perspective, there's my crystal ball. You know, I can say for context, last year we came in around 9%. And I think at that point, we essentially projected that we'd be close to that for the coming years. I think as we're putting our budget together now, certainly we don't expect to be above that 9% number. And I think there's a good chance that we'll come in a little bit below that as well. So more to come as we move towards our September budget introduction, but just to give folks a sense of, you know, the drivers, mitigating factors, where does that leave us? That's kind of what we're seeing today. So I'll close here just with a slide on kind of the next steps from a commission meeting perspective. So September 12th is our budget introduction. September 26th is the public hearing on our budget. October 17th is the commission deliberation on budget. And then October 31st is when we'd be seeking budget approval. So that's what I've got, and I'll pause there for any questions before handing it over to Todd and his capital project presentation.
So we'll spend about 10 minutes here if there are questions. Otherwise, we'll have questions at the end. I want to make sure that we have enough time for Todd. If you have a question, for the benefit of those who are online, we'll bring a mic over to you. So does anyone have questions? And then we'll ask you to state your name for those who are virtual before you start talking.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Cloud from McFarland. Just had a couple of questions for you. You know, with the Clean Water Fund borrowing, you are anticipating the 9% increase. Do you see a larger percentage increase, 1%, 2%, 5%, if you can use the Clean Water Fund?
So it's definitely an upward driver, so to speak, on our costs and on the rate, but we always look at that in the context of everything else going on, right? And so it's on the list in terms of things that are driving upward costs. I don't have a specific number in terms of how much that is, but again, in terms of what we're seeing as a likely rate increase for next year, we think we'll probably be a little bit below 9%. So I think the story is, you know, despite those higher costs from having to do geo-bonding for some of our projects, we think we'll still be able to come in a little bit below 9% because of some of the mitigating factors that I talked about.
Yeah, 9% was really high for all of us anyway. So a little bit below 9% is great, but you know, we're worried about the 9%. I think that's why the room is probably as full as it is. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the CIP and the planning. Does the commission see the CIP planning document, and do they vote on those priorities, or is that something that staff sets and brings to the commission?
Yeah, so, and that's really going to be the focus of Todd's presentation, but the CIP essentially is part of our budget document. And so what you'll see in there is expected costs over the course of the CIP period, and the commission is essentially authorizing those project costs over kind of the lifespan of the construction project, if that makes sense. So they are seeing it as part of the budget approval process.
And is there an opportunity for commission members to discuss and prioritize the items in the CIP?
Yeah, so I can say, so Todd presented, for example, a couple of weeks ago to the commission on what we were seeing for construction projects over the course of the next 6 years. And so what we try and do is share information about what we see as kind of the need for construction projects, and then seek, you know, commission feedback during those discussions, and then specifically during the budgeting process as well.
But there isn't a separate process to vote on the CIP that's separate from the budget process?
No, and folks can correct me if I'm off here, Todd or Bill, but it's essentially what the commission is authorizing is the total spend on projects over the course of the construction period as part of the budget.
Okay. At least for the Village of McFarland, that would be different.
Okay.
We vote on, our staff presents the CIP, and we work through and vote on the CIP in advance of the budget process.
Okay.
And then the 2025 projects, the current year, next year's projects will become part of the budget. So
Okay.
it seems like you are maybe doing it differently.
Bill, did you want to?
I just wanted to give a little bit more context. I agree with Ben's answer. Oh, here we go with the microphone again. Is this my fault? It's my fault. Our development process is following commission policy, so you're right, it is a little bit different than some communities. The other thing that I think is important is the CIP is a very long time frame, and commissioners have a variety of touch points, both with the overall CIP and with individual projects. So every project above a relatively small dollar amount gets commission transaction approval, so they see it before the project initiates. Many of our multi-phase projects have repeated check-in and approvals by the commission. And of course, they see the CIP every single year and have an opportunity to weigh in during the budget process. Many of our projects derive from facilities plans, which they have an opportunity to see as well. So there isn't a single run-through of every single project like you're describing, but there are a variety of touch points that seem to meet commission interest.
Bob Whipperford from the Village of Windsor. During your presentation, you had mentioned that you plan to ramp up the construction projects even more. When I hear that, I hear rates going above 9% after 2025. Is that an accurate statement or not? And then also, how many more years do you plan on doing this aggressive construction projects? Is it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Is it just ongoing?
Yeah, so if that's okay, I'll defer the second part of that question over to Todd's presentation, because that's really the purpose of his presentation. The 9% that we presented last year was really looking over the full, at that point, 6-year 2024 to 2029 CIP period. So the ramping up kind of was inclusive of that, or reflected that 9%, if that makes sense. So we're not seeing large jumps beyond that at this point. It's really, we've already been looking at that, but as we get into 25, we're really kind of heading into that ramp up period, if that makes sense.
Chris Barnes, the town of Verona. I'm curious about the length of time for the rate smoothing, over how many years that you do that estimation, and then what your degree of confidence would be in that projection.
Yeah, so the rate smoothing that we do is on a projected basis, and it's over the 6-year CIP period. So we're doing it as part of our projections. When we get into each year of that CIP, we're kind of essentially, finalizing the budget at that point. But we expect to be roughly along the path that we set, each year as part of our CIP process. So in terms of the confidence, it's based on assumptions that we're making in terms of, what projects we're going to be addressing, based on assumptions related to operating expenses. Things can change, obviously, that are outside of our control. For example, we didn't expect to have to pursue general obligation bonding, right, a year ago today. So, I think we feel pretty comfortable with that approach and pursuing rate smoothing over the course of the CIP. But, things can change. But again, taking a multi-year approach allows us to smooth to a degree. So even if we have, a lumpy expenditure pattern from a capital projects perspective, we can kind of smooth that rate path over that period. That's kind of the goal that we're seeking when we put that together. Any other questions? Oh, one more here.
Hi, Matt Schenke, Administrator in McFarland. Could you go back to that last slide that you had on the, one more? I think it was, not that one. This one, thank you.
Probably not the crystal ball, right?
No, this one, yeah.
Yep.
So looking at this, the budget drivers, which I equate to expenses and mitigating factors, revenues, essentially. Is it fair to say the mitigating factors that you list as revenues only affect the capital side of the equation?
So it directly affects the capital fund reserve, but because we're making transfers from operating into capital to support the capital program, it affects really the budget as a whole, and therefore it affects our service charge revenue requirement.
It does, but if there's an operating expense like increased utility costs, those aren't necessarily mitigating factors to cover those costs because they're not capital, they're operating, right?
So our operating expenses are covered not by the connection charges that flow into the capital fund. Those operating expenses are covered by service charges primarily.
Correct.
But I guess when I'm putting this list together, I'm thinking kind of holistically across all three funds and kind of the net effect of that.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just trying to separate out because that's when any of us do budgeting, there's that differentiation between what can and cannot be used for capital or operating.
Yep.
So then the follow-up to that is what sort of mitigating factors are there to offset increases in operating? Or is the assumption that the rates would pick that up that we all pay?
So there aren't, so the mitigating factors here, as you said, do affect capital fund revenue specifically. So there's not kind of a corollary mitigating factor for the operating fund. So those, so generally when we're looking at operating expenses going up, those are directly, I guess, hitting the service charge revenue requirement unless we happen to have sufficient offsetting revenues from our other more minor revenue sources, but those are quite minor compared to our service charge revenues.
So the assumption is that as your operating costs go up, the member community's operating costs go up?
From a service charge perspective, yes, absent, again, offsetting revenues from other sources.
Okay. When you say consideration of staffing needs, what does the district do to plan for its staffing?
So it's a process that crosses basically all of our district departments, and our management team comes together to discuss what the priorities are, what the needs are by department, and how they address kind of our critical lines of business in terms of treating wastewater. And then there's a rough prioritization process that happens as part of that, and then we put forward a proposal to the commission as part of the budget.
Is that over a sort of a year-to-year basis, or is that multi-year?
We've done that on a multi-year basis, but somewhat similar to our budgeting process as a whole, we're kind of truing that up as we go year to year. So we've identified needs that go beyond 2025, but I think until we get there and get a sense of, okay, are these critical given where we sit today? We don't know with certainty whether those are ever going to be put forward as part of the budget.
And then you said that the requests for staffing are presented to the board or district board. What's their role in making decisions through policy that ultimately authorize filling vacancies?
Sure. So they're authorizing the expenditure. That's part of that as part of the budget proposal.
So once they are convinced to allocate the funds for the position, then it's an administrative function to fill it.
Correct.
And advance it.
Yep.
So we'll take the last question from Ms. Clout, and then we're going to move over to Todd's presentation to make sure we have enough time for that, but we will certainly have more time for questions. So go ahead.
I was just wondering about the staffing also. Are those new positions that you were talking about, or percentage increase, annual increase for staff?
They're net new positions. Yeah. Yep. All right, thank you.
All right, with that, we're going to turn it over to Todd Giebert. Todd has promised me he's not going to break the clicker.
I think I said we'll see.
We'll see.
Mic working okay for people? Great. Good afternoon. I think we're past noon. Todd Giebert, Capital Planning Manager. Here to talk about the 2025 Capital Improvements Plan. What I'd really like to do today, though, is provide a little more context. I know there's a lot of questions about how projects get into our CIP, so I want to talk a little bit about facility planning, how that leads to our projects, what's driving our infrastructure needs, some of the recent projects that we've invested in the last 20 to 25 years, and then close with projects that are affecting us going forward. So a little bit about our capital projects planning hierarchy, if you will. At the very top is master planning. This is usually a long lookout of 50 years. So we did our last 50-year plan in 2009 to kind of define our long-range objectives. So we feel good about that. Below that is facilities planning. So that's a much smaller time frame, usually 20 years. And in those, you're kind of assessing your assets, finding assets that are in need, developing alternatives to address those needs, and then picking the lowest cost option. So that's really where we focus our time. And the good thing is, since we do get so much money from the Clean Water Fund, our projects usually seek that borrowing, is that it's a requirement of the Clean Water Fund. So that's usually our process. And then those, in turn, those projects lead into our CIP. So for facility plans, there's kind of two different areas. There's the collection system, which involves our interceptor or gravity sewers, our pump stations and force mains. So that's basically everything on the map that you see up here. And then there's a different process for our treatment plant projects. So for collection system assets, we've done those plans in-house with district staff. We did the first plan in 2002, our second plan in 2011, and we're currently wrapping up our third one. So I think in our last one, we've instituted about 39 of the 43 projects that were recommended. So we follow it very closely. For the treatment plant, they're a little different. We don't have a master facility plan, if you will. In that case, they're a little more project-driven or, a specific driver like some regulatory requirement or expansion. And our latest one here is the liquid processing facilities plan, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but that's about a $100 million project that's instituted over many years. The one thing we did starting in with the last CIP last year was identify just a basic project driver. Why are we doing these projects? So we broke them into 4 categories. And you see that the vast majority, about 2/3, are due to condition, our aging assets, which I'm sure you're all facing with your systems as well. To a lesser degree, about 1/3 of the projects are capacity driven. And then really no regulatory drivers, pure regulatory drivers in this plan. And then even less in resilience. So resilience would be things like redundancy that we'd like to build in our system, but just don't have the resources to do that right now. So with regard to capacity, obviously that's driven mainly by population growth. This is something I'm sure these numbers don't surprise any of you. Dane County is generally among the highest growing counties in the state. I got these numbers off the DOA's website just in the last 4 years. I think Dane County is second in growth. So that also affects the district. And usually our policy is we like to be out in front of the growth, provided so that the communities don't have to face any kind of moratorium on growth with regard to sewer service. So these just show some of the projects that we've invested in over the last 20 to 25 years. The biggest one would be our Northeast Interceptor, not coincidentally named for serving the northeast side of the service area. So this would mainly serve like Waunakee and DeForest, who weren't included in the district service area when the sewers were first built. So almost $40 million in costs there. Another one is what we call our West Interceptor. So this would be along University Avenue, from roughly Camp Randall Stadium out to Whitney Way. So if any of you have driven through the construction on University Avenue, we're partly to blame for that, not all. That's part of a 7-phase project, which will be wrapping up next year. And then the third project that we've also in the midst of completing is what we call our Lower Badger Mill Creek Interceptor, which extends from the city of Verona all the way up to Midtown Road. So these are just examples of projects that we've addressed or are instituted to address continued growth in the service area. And then obviously we have a couple more planned in the CIP, the 2025 CIP, an extension up in Wanakee, and then also what we call our Nine Springs Valley Interceptor, which cuts through the city of Fitchburg. Along with capacity, though, age of the system is becoming a bigger concern. This bar chart shows when our interceptor system, our gravity sewers were installed by decade. So pretty clear there was a big boom after World War II, roughly in the 60s and 70s. As the service area grew, interceptors were installed. So over 70% of our system was installed before 1980. So if you assume that those sewers last anywhere from 50 to 75 years, you do the math, we need to be planning for rehabilitating those systems. So one way we do that, probably not unlike you, is through inspecting our sewers through TV. We do that on a periodic basis. One thing we have instituted differently, though, in the last year is this idea of risk. What is the risk to the interceptor system? So we've introduced an element on the x-axis there. What is the consequence of failure? What if these sewers fail us in any way? So the product of those things, the probability of failure, and the consequence of failure results in a score for these different interceptor systems. The good news is that we think the system is relatively healthy. 2/3 are in the green or in reasonably good risk shape. But that third that's in yellow is concerning because that can move up into the red area. And that's where our attention is focused right now. So just an example of we have started to notice some problems in the system. This is a picture of a repair that was made on Allen Boulevard near Marshall Park last year. Relatively minor problem, maybe a small joint deflection in a manhole that had settled. But for us, this is a big deal. Due to the volume of flow, you just see some of the problems in this picture. Usually our sewers are 20 to 25 deep, so we have complicated shoring systems, excavations. We're usually in groundwater, so the dewatering is difficult. In this case, we also had to divert Allen Boulevard traffic. We're deep, so that other utilities, you see a water main had to be relocated around our facility. So just to put in 60 feet of pipe and 3 new manholes cost us over $630,000. So those are the situations we're trying to avoid. Like our interceptor system, our pump stations are also about the same age. Unfortunately, these don't last quite as long, usually 40 to 50 years. So beginning about the year 2000, we started a big program to rehabilitate these on a periodic basis. And to date, we rehabilitated 14 out of our 18 stations. And you see the year that each was rehabilitated here at a cost of about $90 million. So we feel pretty good about the pump stations. They're in good shape. When we rehabilitate it, I mean, we're going through and basically replacing all the electrical, mechanical, and control systems. So these should be good for a while, but what we'd like to do going forward is do smaller projects on a more frequent basis to make sure that we don't have this big ramp up. That brings us to the treatment plant. So the treatment plant, again, is a little bit of a different animal. Usually projects in the past have been done by big additions. So there's been 11 plant additions between 1934 and 2014. This is a picture of the first addition in 1934. So you see a couple sludge storage tanks and a couple digesters. They're actually still in service today if you go down the hill here. But these projects are big, again. They're usually two years to do facility planning, 2 years to do the design, and then maybe 2 to 3 years to construct. So kind of the way we did them was by the time you get done with one, you're kind of moving on to the next one. And that served us fairly well, but now with condition becoming such a big deal, that may not be the model we can follow anymore. And this just speaks to some of the condition of our structures. I think I'm going last because you're done eating, hopefully. There's far worse pictures I could show, but this just shows one of our structures. It basically splits flow to each side of the plant. And this structure is not that old. It's about 20 years old, but you can already see the corrosion The picture on the right is actually showing the reinforcing steel, which is very troublesome. So that's just one condition or example of condition degradation. Another is a little more easier to understand. Obviously, we use a lot of power here at the plant, fuel all the processes, but the electric service is not, it will not last forever. So there's a substation that is right next to the plant, conveniently located, but that service and the equipment that takes to take that power and distribute it to all the plant processes won't last forever. So you see there's pictures of switchgear and transformers here. The service life is usually 40 years, and we're coming up on that right now. So this is just a risk that we're not willing to take to live with us until it fails, because we would lose the processes that are associated with that. So moving on now to the actual 2025 CIP, this is kind of how it breaks down as far as costs. Again, it's a 6-year lookout, so across the 6 years, it's about $279 million in costs. Compare that to last year's CIP, it's about the same amount of spending. So that's why the level of increase is we're able to keep that relatively flat. You also see here that broken down by category that I just went through. So as I mentioned, pump stations are becoming a little less larger percentage of the pie, and the plant projects are becoming a larger percent. This shows the annual expenditures of the 6 years, so you can see that rise in spending that we've been talking about. We're kind of trying to hit an average of about $45 million for each year of the 6-year plan. Some large projects in there, the liquid processing one that I just mentioned, $100 million is kind of spread amongst all those years. The other thing you see here is in the blue is the actual cost that we spent in the last 5 years, and Ben mentioned the underspending. So just a couple points on that. So underspending generally results due to delays in projects. We try to be a little aggressive in our spending because we don't want to run out of money, obviously. But any kind of delay to a project shifts those costs into another year. And so as Ben mentioned, that money though stays in the fund, it doesn't go anywhere else. The other thing that I'll say is that the budgeted expenditures, that doesn't necessarily mean that the revenue is already raised. As Ben pointed out, about 80% of our spending comes from the Clean Water Fund, so we only get those revenues when we spend the money. I didn't mention the project delays. This has resulted in some projects stacking up, if you will. So we have a lot going to construction right now. In the last year, we bid out 6 projects for a total cost of about $55 million. So the construction is ramping up. But the good news is it's relatively on budget. You see it last year. CIP, we estimated those projects would cost $56 million. Now with the bid results, we're thinking they'll be $55 million. So our spending plan looks pretty good right now, or our financing plan, I should say. I'm taking a little bit deeper dive then in the year 25, our capital budget. Some of that $55 million that I mentioned is already been committed in construction contracts. So we think next year we'll spend $25 million of that, or roughly half of our total budgeted expenditures. The other category there, design in progress. So all those projects actually are in some level of design, and we think that category, another $12 million will be spent in construction. So I guess the story of this slide is that these projects are actively being worked on, and we feel good about the projection for next year. I'd like to wrap up just by talking about 3 large projects at the plant that are kind of driving the spending over the 6 years. I've mentioned a couple times liquid processing improvements phase 2. So the big project here is changes to our activated sludge system. So if anyone's taken a tour of the plant, these are the long rectangular tanks in the center of the plant. And they're used to basically blow air, which you see in the upper right, those are blowers. They blow air into those tanks. The bugs use that air or dissolved oxygen to eat up the nitrogen and phosphorus. So that equipment, again, is nearing 40 to 50 years, needs to be replaced. And the neat thing about this project, though, is we hope to do this with far less energy. I think this is the 2nd largest user of energy at the plant. So hopefully we can institute a process that uses far less energy. Another project that has the energy focus is what we call our heat and power improvements. So you may be aware that we also generate our own electricity at the plant, about 1/3 of our needs through biogas. That the picture at the lower left is one of the engine generators that burns the biogas and then distributes electricity to the plant. Unfortunately, that is a picture of them taking it out of the building for repairs. Those have need to be rebuilt several times in the past few years. So this project basically is taking a look at, do we want to continue the model of continuing to use biogas for energy production, or do we want to clean up the gas and sell it to a regional provider, much like the county does at their landfill? So that work just started this year, facility planning, and we'll see what it's planned to be completed next year. And then the third project is our what we call biosolids improvements. So right now, biosolids are stored at the plant, and then they're taken to local farm fields and injected into through land spreading in spring and fall of each year. The program is very successful, but we are running out of storage, mainly due to factors such as climate change, where the fields are wetter, we're getting more rain, we don't have as many days to land apply. So we're going to begin a facility planning process next year that will look at three main areas. If we keep our existing program, how do we increase storage and our ability to haul the biosolids away from the plant? Secondly, should we be looking at other products that require less storage? And then third, we want to make sure that we're ensuring the sustainability of our program. There's emerging contaminants like PFAS that we know are in our biosolids. This is a national problem, and we want to make sure we're doing the right thing moving forward. So with that, I'll just wrap up by saying, there's three main points, I guess, to my presentation today. Number one, growth. Has been a big factor in the last 20 years, and it will continue to be so. We're going to keep expanding our infrastructure to accommodate that growth. But at the same time, our assets are aging, and they need to be refurbished. And that has resulted in our capital program needing to expand to accommodate those needs. So with that, Amanda, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Todd. So again, we'll open it up for questions here. If our guests on the Zoom meeting have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and we will be sure to grab you between kind of moving in and out of the room. So with that, anyone have questions? We've got time.
Two questions. One on the...
Can you state your name quick? So
Pardon?
they just state your name, Forbes, so they know.
Sorry, Forbes McIntosh, represent Dane County Cities and Villages and staff the Executive Council. With the 6-year CIP plan, and I know in 2021 there was the 6-year plan that kind of generated the 9% per year increase for 6 years to end in 2027. Do you see that then continuing the 9% back, or at 2028, does it now go down because we're not doing that plan any longer?
Well, the 9% is overall, right? There's a component for the capital program, but I think that part for the capital program will persist for, I can't say for sure how long, but just those three projects alone for the treatment plant, I mean, those are long-range projects that extend well beyond the 6 years.
Got it. And then, apologize, no, I think that's all I had, yeah.
And just to build on that a little bit, so that the heat and power project that I mentioned, we actually don't have any infrastructure costs in the plan to address that need, realizing that, there's limitations to what we can accomplish in 6 years. So that would have to be outside that 6-year window.
And I just remember the last question. On the Metro Grow, is there a decreasing demand because of the PFAS issues with farmers, or is it steady, or is it expected demand to go low?
Marty Griffin may be best positioned to answer that, but right now we haven't seen any, I'm sure there's concern, but we haven't seen any drop off that I'm aware of.
Hi, Marty Griffin, Ecosystem Services Director. The question was, is that we're seeing a change in demand of our land applied biosolids based on PFAS? We're currently not seeing a change in demand, so we're still able to get the product land applied necessary with enough storage. We are seeing increased landowner concern though, and so we're trying to be as transparent as possible. We sample our biosolids, provide information so people can make their own decisions. But we don't know what the future holds, and as we learn more about biosolids and PFAS, those things may change. So for now, we're feeling good, but a lot to happen, can happen.
Could you come back to this slide with the budgeted capital projects versus the actual? So for one, thank you for answering this question.
Sure.
I know this slide doesn't, you know, this is something that we've asked a lot about and talked a lot about in executive council and asked a lot about this question, right? So when you're setting your rate for us and you're establishing that 9% that we've been seeing, some of us even higher depending on the year, you're setting it based on the budgeted expenditure number, right? And so we have all been paying in our 9% or whatever it is based on your budgeted number. That number is clearly higher than what you're actually able to accomplish in a year. And we get it. We are all part of municipalities. We know how hard it is to get those projects across the finish line, and we appreciate that. But it's a lot. I mean, the difference is almost double in every single year. But our ratepayers are paying for the green line. Our ratepayers are not paying for the blue line. Now, eventually that it probably gets to your reserve number issue, and I would imagine your capital reserve figure is representative of the difference between the blue and the green lines there and will cause some rebalancing, but this is what we're worried about, right? So if we at least have projects that we can see from y'all, we have something to show for the 9%. If we have that gap, but we're all paying, that's concerning or highly concerning to us. And what's up with the gap?
Yep, good question. I understand the concern. The underspending isn't directly resulting in a 9% increase. It's increasing our reserve amount that really is driving part of that. So that comes from the service charges. So our reserves a couple of years ago were dangerously close to exhausting them. We were, I think, end of the year, maybe at $1 million in reserves. Now they're much healthier. So part of that, I think you referenced 2021, and we started building up the reserves. Does that sound right? So you're not actually paying for the green bar, all of that. Certainly some of the cash on hand, but like I was trying to say with the loan part of it is that revenue isn't realized until we spend the money through debt, borrowing from the Clean Water Fund. So just some of that difference between the blue bar and the green bar is due to cash that we have on hand.
I'm going to step in here. This is Bill Walker again. This is an extremely important question. I agree with what Todd has said. We have debated this graph internally because the job of this graph is to compare what we plan to do versus what we did. And as Todd mentioned, this graph is not telling a story about revenue. It's telling a story about planning. And it's represented in terms of dollars because that's the metric we have available to us. So whatever color the ones on the left are, somebody tell me what that color is. Blue? That's actual expenditures. That's truly what happened. The green bars are a way to describe what we expect we could get done. And there's a couple points here. Todd already made one of them. For any project that is funded through the Clean Water Fund loan program, if we don't spend in that year, no revenue arrives. So the actual revenue associated with that year is actually lower. This is representing our planning number, not the actual revenue number. I'm aware this is a confusing point, which is why I'm taking time on it. So that's one point. You have to understand what the story of this graph is. Another point is the discussion of reserves is very hard to do in language without graphs. When we get to introducing the budget to the commission, I invite you all to watch because we will have a graphical and more detailed representation of how we manage our fund reserves. And you will also see that represented in the budget document itself. There are a variety of tables in the budget document back for several years that describe the management of each individual fund, reserve requirements, actual reserves, expenditures, revenue. So if you really want detail, that's the place to go. And of course, we're glad to meet with people. One other point to make about this graph is you suggested that the difference between those two bars is the reserves. That is not correct. This graph is not depicting anything to do with reserves. We would need a totally different tool to talk about reserves, which again will show. One other point I want to make, and Ben alluded to it, we have gone through a period where, because of underspending and a little bit because of increased connection charges revenue, our reserves are higher than they need to be. And we know that, and that's something we're going to correct. The other reason they're higher than they need to be is, for the first time, we have consulted with a professional municipal advisor who, the team, looked through our reserves policies, our spending forecast, and all of this stuff, and said, you know what, your reserve calculation is more or less right. You can tweak it a little bit, but you're carrying more than you need to. So, and again, Ben alluded to this, you will see in our budget presentation that our proposal has a plan to ramp down our reserves gradually over time to get closer to that reserve requirement. So part of the underlying question here is, so what about that extra money? There is extra money. We have a plan to pull it back down. And this is one of the issues that we will, that the commission will be able to grapple with. Are you doing that at the right pace? And so on. So that's a sort of long discussion of what I think is an extremely important kind of fundamental question from folks. And again, we'd be glad to talk about it more, and you'll see more in the budget presentation.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on that point and make sure Carolyn's question is clear, because what's showing on this graph is why we're frustrated, at least as a member community and being a part of this district. Look at 2023, for instance. There's a 3-to-1 gap between what you budgeted for expenses and what you actually expended. I understand what you just explained. I get it. We operate that way to an extent. But her point is that in 2023, when you established a budget at $32 million, you created a rate structure based on that $32 million. Is that not correct? Is that accurate? Yes, that is accurate. So as such, the only amount that you expended then in the next year would be the $10 million that's listed, correct? So her point, concern, and frustration is that the amount that the ratepayers, that is the revenue you gained. That's not the amount you borrowed. You gained that revenue, and there is a tremendous gap, a 3-to-1 gap in just that year alone of how much the ratepayers were charged versus what you expended. That is the concern. And that is what we're trying to get to the bottom of, that if we operated that way as municipalities, we'd all be out of a job. It's not feasible for us to take on projects without expending them. We can't operate that way. And the ability for us to continue to do this in this manner is just not sustainable for our community. And that's the point I think you're trying to make. And that's what we've been talking about amongst ourselves that we're bringing to you today, is that this way of thinking has to change, or this just cannot be sustainable for the work that we do as a group.
Right, and I agree. And my main point is, on a forward-looking basis, we're doing everything we can to close that gap, and that'll be the challenge for you, to see if we succeed in that, and to continue the pressure if we don't.
But I think the challenge for you is that gap is not acceptable. Like, the rate that you would charge us for a $10 million capital budget is different than the rate that you would charge us for a $32 million capital budget. And that difference, and I mean, raise your hand if that difference is unacceptable for your community. Because for the Village of McFarland, that difference is unacceptable. I don't think there's anybody here representing their municipality who would say that that difference is acceptable. Do I believe that you guys are good planners? Do I believe that you guys care about the sewage district and the environment? I absolutely believe that. And I'm not here to say, like, let's attack the guys from MMSD because, you know, Bill gets this role of being the interim guy when everyone's pissed off and they come in for lunch, right? But what we're saying is, like, you would set a different rate. And so what you have to respect is, for us as communities, when we're passing this on, like, we don't get to set our rates like that because we've borrowed that almost all of us have borrowed that $32 million. We don't get to do this, right? So we don't get to have this play, but your rate would be different. And for those of us that are representing people in our communities who are the least able to pay, they're very sensitive to that, and our communities are very sensitive to that. So what our ask is of you, and what we, I think, have been saying in different ways over the years, is like, we need you to not have that. We understand that you need to have it some, because your funding mechanism is a little bit different than our funding mechanism is using the Clean Water Fund, and we can respect that. But those numbers should be closer, and what the cost is to our ratepayers and what the cost is that we're passing along is a lot higher than it needs to be, and we need you to hear that. And, you know, I hope that others will chime in. I've talked a lot today, but we need you to hear that. It's what we've been trying to say. Not in a beatdown kind of a way. We respect what you do, and I sure as heck do not want to set up a sewage treatment plant in the village of McFarland. And we know we're never going to do that, right? Neither is anybody else in this room, but we need those numbers to be closer together. They don't have to line up perfectly. We understand that they can't, but we need them to be closer by a lot.
Hi, everyone. I'm on the commission, and I'm so glad I'm here listening. I just want to have a follow-up to this thread we're on, and I don't know if it was Ben or Todd talked about when we don't spend it all, we carry it forward. Could staff please explain more what that means in relation to this graph? Or Bill? Thank you.
Let's see, the question in the room is, say a little bit more about carryover of unspent capital funds. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to say more other than to repeat. We manage the capital fund so that any revenues that are deposited into that fund stay there and then are used for capital projects. I think that is pertinent to a expenditure control sort of fund management point of view. I will say I don't think that addresses the point that Ms. Clow is making, which is more about alignment of revenue requirements and actual costs. And the only thing I can say there is, again, we have worked very hard as a district in the upcoming budget to push those things to be closer aligned.
Ms. Belmel, if you would like to go ahead, please feel free.
Thank you very much. And I have to apologize. I was pulled away for a couple of minutes, a couple of different times. So I may be asking a question that you already addressed, but I'm not, if you gave an explanation of why the spending came in lower, I think that's my question. And I guess related to that and more specifically, I know in the city of Madison, we sometimes spend slower than anticipated because getting contractors can take time, or we have so many projects on our plates that just carrying them all forward at once can be a challenge. So when I see a history of spending lower than planned, it makes me wonder if there's just natural constraints in the labor market that create kind of a ceiling here. Or if that's not the reason, but if it were, it would certainly be a factor going forward. So I wonder if you could just comment on that a little, if you haven't already.
I can address that. Yeah, so we have taken some steps that we hope to address it. I mean, certainly there's a staffing component to this that we've tried to address. I would also say that some of those years that were shown were COVID years, which I think was tough for everybody to navigate. And then we've also had a transition in our engineering department, their leadership, that's all kind of factored into that. So not to say we have everything figured out, but I think we're working on those three areas, and we feel comfortable with the plan that we've developed.
And I'll expand on that just a little bit. One of the specific factors that the various planners have dealt with is the fact that for any project that has a lot of electrical equipment, lead times are extremely long. To me, they're comically long. They're 2 or 3 years in some cases. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon. Early plans that were made in the early 2020s were not taking account of that. We have adjusted our project plans to reflect those kind of lead times. That's I give that as an illustration of our attempt to get at some of the factors that you were getting at.
I will just add that another factor too is a lot of these projects we can't do alone and that we need, partnership or collaboration or easements or things like that. And I'm sure everyone has had this experience. Those can take more time to work through than we had anticipated. So there are a few projects which moved a little bit slower because we needed to negotiate easements or get landowner agreements or access agreements and things such as that.
Sure, and that makes sense. And I guess my question was, and you've kind of answered it, but it was to say if this is a rate of activity that is 46, 45, 44, 48 million dollars per year of activity something that we think can be achieved in the market, just with all of the barriers and challenges that exist?
This is Bill Walker again. The point to be made here is to repeat one that Todd made. The phase on the left of that graph was sort of predominantly a planning phase, and you can't start sending money out the door until you move into construction. The bar for 2025, most of those projects are already underway. So once you're in construction, the money does flow much better, and that's, one of the factors that give us more confidence that this pace is something we can actually achieve, recognizing it is very different than what you're seeing historically.
Yeah, Tim Wannick, Utilities. Todd, Bill, Ben, thanks for explanations on all this stuff. 2 questions. One being, from my perspective, it seems like all these projects are just kind of come and due at once here. And is it a fair question to ask, should we have really started these like 5-10 years ago? Because it just seems like everything's happening at once.
Yeah, that wasn't by design that they stacked up like that. So that's part of the why you see the underspending in some of those prior years. To Amanda's point, there's stakeholder engagement that is taking much longer than it ever has before. One project got delayed at least a year just due to those things. And we think that's the right thing to do, right? Is to act in good faith and engage our stakeholders. So that wasn't by design, but that is one, results.
And the other question I have is, what are the total operating revenues each year for the district? Isn't it like 40, 50 million or so?
You have that offhand?
Whatever the number is, if you look at spending 40-some million dollars a year, it just seems like on a macro sense that it could put the district in a pretty bad spot for having to spend. I mean, you're spending as much as you are taking in revenues in 1 year just on your capital. And from a perspective of looking at it from a macro sense, having all this debt, it just seems like it could risk the overall financial health of the district by doing that. Sorry if I'm getting a little too deep in the weeds, Bill, but I don't know if that's a question or just a comment. I'd say it's a question then, does it seem like you're putting the district in peril by borrowing so much money when your revenues are relatively low?
All right, so try to repeat the question. The observation here is that if you spend at this rate or at any rate and borrow 80% of that capital spending, you are going to, of course, accumulate debt. The reason to do that, there are 2 reasons that we're doing that. One is it's commission policy. I invite you to read commission policies because they're detailed but interesting. Rely on the Clean Water Fund is one of the existing policies, so that's what we're doing. The other is, and to get away from finance a little bit and introduce the underlying objective, we've got a lot of very old things that are going to break. And just sort of speaking personally as the interim director, I'm going to introduce a budget that does everything we can to fund those needs. I don't want to be the one who has us failing to comply with things. You are correct that debt accumulates. One of the issues we've asked our financial advisor is the impact of that on, for instance, ratings or ability to finance things. And although it does seem like a lot, this is completely consistent with typical regional utility finance. We're not deviating from what other utilities do. I personally would prefer to carry less debt, but the only way to do that is to either dramatically increase service charges or not do the work that Todd has identified as being really critical. So that's kind of the balance we're we're trying to strike here, and debt is the way for us to get a lot of things done in a short time. Ben would like to add something.
Just to add something, and Tim, I don't know if this is exactly responsive to your question, but just to introduce the point in case it was a point of confusion. When we talk about a $55, $60 million operating revenue number, we're not, the 45, the 48 that you're seeing here is not 90% of that number, right? The expenditures in green are being paid by Clean Water Fund loan revenues that are offsetting, that are not reflected in that $55, $60 million number. So to put it differently, it's not the case that if we have a $55 million budget and we're spending $45 million in the year I can't see there, that all of our other expenses are $10 million. Does that make sense? It's the expenditures that you're seeing here are kind of off to the side in the capital fund, where you've got outflows from the capital fund in actual cash, but then inflows from the Clean Water Fund revenues. So there's kind of an offsetting effect there that is separate and distinct from our $55, $60 million operating budget, if that makes sense.
This is Commissioner Booklin, and I just wanted to have a kind of a question and a comment. These last 5 years have been unusual years because of COVID. And we got hit with COVID, all of us, and that impacted our ability to budget and spend. So it impacted supplies, ability to get supplies, it impacted staffing, it impacted a lot of things. And I think that maybe, Bill, you could explain a little bit about how we are trying to kind of recover from all of that, because it kind of threw a monkey wrench in a lot of our planning. And so can you address a little bit about how we're moving forward after all of these unexpected changes?
If you're in the room, you can see me having a bemused smile on my face because I'm not sure I can answer that question. But I think kind of to repeat the point, I've been here for 8 years. Things are a lot different in planning post-COVID than they were pre-COVID. I alluded to one already. The supply chain genuinely was significantly disrupted. You're experiencing that as well. We're having to change the schedule of a bunch of our projects. And I'm not sure what else to add beyond that unless you have more, Todd or Ben, but I think the thing to take away is it's not imaginary, and it's not sort of a one-time, oh gosh, COVID is over. There's an enduring change that we are adjusting our planning to try to accommodate. And again, I think the main point I've been making here is the past is the past, and we are making a lot of effort to change how we are doing things going forward to accommodate this or match this new reality.
Questions, and if our theme today has been CIP and budget, if there are other questions as well, you're free to ask them.
Okay. Just one other question. I wanted to echo the sentiments of Carolyn and Matt from McFarland. I think they stated it quite well. I would also say that you call us owner communities, and we expect and we appreciate a seat at the table. But when we voice these concerns, we want you to hear us. We don't want to just pass the time of day. We want you to hear what our concerns are, because the spending that hasn't happened directly affects our municipalities, it affects our residents. And as one of them said, this is not sustainable. And, you know, the sign of good leaders is to change with new information as that becomes available. And I think that's what we all need to consider. Thank you.
Bill Chang, Village of the Forest. You know, on the points about, you know, capital improvement and projects that need to get done, I think we all understand infrastructure. We understand that needs to get done. And what it seems to me is more of, you know, what is the expectation of management of the revenues coming in for the capital projects and getting the projects done in time. And I think that's some of the questions that we have here, which also leads to, you know, when I heard about, you know, the financial forecasting, you know, is that how is that what are the variables in that forecasting? How much of it is related to growth, population, especially in Dane County? And then I would assume that as we are replacing infrastructure, that we're considering higher capacity, which obviously then comes with more of a cost. And so if I could hear, or if someone can answer more about those variables, and then how that affects kind of the management of the funds that are being held by the district before they get expended in a project.
I'm not sure I understand the question necessarily. Are you asking if we consider conditions at the same time we're planning for capacity?
Yeah, so that's one. So two questions. One is the planning of when the infrastructure gets in. Is the population growth being considered, and where's that data point being pulled from? Is it the MPO? Is it somewhere else? And the second question is related to, so we saw the graph, we saw the actual spend being less than the budgeted, which the rates are set on. If we're collecting more than we're able to spend, what is that money doing? Because it means something to the client, the customer, of when that money gets levied. What is that money doing in the meantime?
So yes, you're correct. In the first case, when we do a rehab project, we would definitely look at capacity of anything. So there's basically a couple ways to address condition. You can either do it in place, line the sewer and extend the life, or you can replace it, in which case we would consider the capacity in both those instances. Second question, I guess, I don't know, Bill, if you have anything more to add to that, but essentially, again, it stays in the capital reserve fund once it comes in there. So it would be part of next year's budget if there's anything that we didn't spend. I guess is the easiest way to say it, and figure it in next year's rates.
Anyone else? We have about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jim Wolf from City of Madison. I had a quick question regarding your graph on the risk management and your capital planning. Is your methodology on how you determine the probability and consequence of failure, is that made available to folks? And is this part of your discussion with the commission when you're bringing proposed projects and things to the commission for approval?
So I don't know if you're familiar with PACP, NASCO's. Yeah, so it's built off of that. Some of the criteria for how you score, the 1 through 5 is a little bit in-house. But the methodology is essentially that. And there's all kinds of places that have advanced asset management tools, but we can share that with you if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. And the second part of is this part of the discussion when you're bringing projects to the commission too, so that they're kind of made aware of.
Yeah, we actually presented this to the commission in May. It's prioritization of projects. To get back to the earlier question about how do you prioritize projects, this is an attempt to do that, right? We do share it with the commission.
Thank you.
Mary O'Connor, City of Monona. I just have a question, and I don't know if you can answer this or not, but related to the GO borrowing that you're probably going to have to do. Do you have any idea what percentage of your total borrowing that might be?
So we made an assumption that it would be 20% going forward. That's very rough. Actually, for the limitations that Ben mentioned with the Clean Water Fund, we've been pleasantly surprised so far. We've gotten everything that we've submitted for. I don't know if that's going to continue. I don't think the DNR knows for sure if that's going to continue into the next fiscal year, but so far, things look fairly good.
Sorry, I just had a follow-up question on the rollover of funds in the capital fund balance. And kind of looking at the map, I mean, as you're budgeting, it seems to be like, you're continuing to stack up on revenue funds coming into that capital improvement fund. But it looks to me like, the timeline for the projects that you have planned are falling behind, right? And so the timing of those don't necessarily match up, and so seems to me like your revenues would be growing over time. You know, in DeForest, what we would do is we would swap in capital projects to be able to utilize the revenues that we collect towards that plan itself. I don't know if that's the instance here, if you're swapping out projects, or, you know, I guess the question is what is being done to manage the plan from the budget itself?
Yeah, I'd say we kind of have the opposite problem in a sense. It's not that we don't have enough projects to do, it's that they take too long and that the reserves are accumulating. But I think what we're trying to convey here is that when you commit them to construction, you'll draw that down very quickly. And that's what we're seeing going forward. But there has been delay in projects that have led to those reserves increasing. And some of that, again, was by design. It wasn't just by accident project delays. Some of that was very planned to build up the reserves.
All right. Well, it is just a minute or two before 1 o'clock. Certainly staff will be around if you want to, if you have additional questions that didn't get answered, please also feel free to email me and I can pass your questions along. Sometime tomorrow you will also get an email with a short survey about the meeting, just to kind of get feedback about both what we talked about here today and the meeting itself, because we certainly want to continue to have these conversations and these gatherings and just need to figure out what works best for everyone. And I hope this lunch meeting worked out today. Certainly there's some more food outside if you want to grab something to go, especially if you've got to go back and work some elections. You may have a longer day ahead of you. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. It was great to have you in person here at the district. Again, don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions. Oh, one other thing wanted to mention, and I'll put this on the survey as well, but once our budget gets introduced in September, or even before then, if you would like our staff to come have a conversation with you or meet with one of your boards, present to one of your boards, we are more than happy to do that. Please just reach out to me and I will help get that facilitated. I'll also include that on the survey. So with that, thank you all so much for being here today. It is beautiful outside. Hope you get a little bit of that warm weather and sunshine, and thank you so much.